As Pope Francis often says, concrete acts of love are so much more important than words. If Catholic social teaching is only something we think about in our heads, we're not doing it right. Back in 1971, Pope St. Paul VI released a Catholic social teaching document called Octogesima Adveniens on the occasion of the 80th anniversary of Rerum Novarum. In the document, he called on members of the Church to notice social ills around us, analyze and reflect on them, and take action to address the injustice. The practical method I'll talk about now is called the pastoral circle, and it is one great way to do all those tasks St. Paul VI mentions in that quote. Pastoral circle was first introduced to faith-based communities by a Catholic think tank called the Center of Concern in 1980. There are four elements of the circle: experience, social analysis, theological reflection, and pastoral action. For purposes of this discussion, I'll use the example of fighting for humane immigration reform in the Diocese of Camden, New Jersey. But you can use the method to address any number of important social issues in any number of ministry contexts. The first step in the circle is the experience of the social issue. Back in February of 2013, a priest in the Diocese of Camden, who was the pastor of a parish with a large immigrant population, called a meeting of all the leaders throughout the diocese who worked with immigrants. The meeting brought together about 40 different priests, deacons, religious sisters, and lay people who worked with immigrants at parishes, schools, and Catholic social services all across the region. Most work with Latinos from places like Mexico and Central and South America, but the Camden Diocese also has a fairly large Asian immigrant community and several other smaller groups. The first thing they did at the meeting was break into small groups to tell stories about their experiences working with these communities. A Mexican nun told heartbreaking stories of families in her parish that had been separated by deportation. So many of the people live in fear, she said, and most of them have to stay in the shadows to avoid being caught by immigration authorities. The large group came back together and shared common threads they had heard in each other's stories. It was clear from their experiences that there was great fear and tremendous challenges across the immigrant communities in South Jersey. The group decided it would be smart to work together to take action for and with these marginalized individuals and families. With this common experience in mind, the group participated in the next stage of the pastoral circle, social analysis, during subsequent meetings. Working with a community organizer who was an expert in public policy, they discussed the root causes of the suffering that immigrants were facing. There are about 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States at that time. Why are they here? Most often they come seeking better lives for their families. Out of desperation, they either overstayed visas or crossed the border illegally to reach the United States. Strict immigration laws made it impossible for these individuals to have legal work, but a robust under-the-table economy allowed many of them to work in fields like landscaping, agriculture, childcare, and domestic work. The country's immigration laws meant that while many of the children of the adult immigrants here were citizens of the United States, the adults were not and were therefore threatened by the possibility of deportation to their country of origin. Families were being torn apart. What was worse, there was no way out of the shadows for so many of these undocumented immigrants, as our country provides very few means of regularization for those who are here illegally. There was no pathway to citizenship or legal permanent status available. Further, they discussed the fact that while so many of our Catholic parishes had immigrant members, our Anglo-Catholics often didn't extend a welcome to the newcomers from other countries. There weren't too many good examples of understanding or kinship across the citizen boundary. It felt like they would need to encourage Anglo-Catholics to be strong allies of our immigrant communities if they wish to have an impact on the situation. As they were participating in this social analysis, they started the process of theological reflection, the third movement in the pastoral circle. In theological reflection, we bring our faith and values to the situation and ask how a community of faith might respond to the issue in front of us. In theological reflection, we ask questions like, where's God in all this? What does the gospel call us to do? What does our church teach about this issue and why? What is the role for the church to respond to this particular situation? What demands does this issue make on ministry, the laity, and the community? How is God calling me to respond in my own life? Each of the group's meetings would include some prayer and reflection, helping them to root their discussion and planning in their shared faith. It was important for all of them to learn about the Catholic Church's rich teaching on migration and the treatment of immigrants. They prayed with powerful scripture passages that talk about migration, including God's reminder to the Israelites in the Old Testament never to oppress a stranger in their midst, for they themselves had been strangers in the land of Egypt. They talked about how the infant Jesus and the Holy Family were migrants themselves, fleeing King Herod into Egypt. They visited the U.S. Bishop's website, justiceforimmigrants.org, which outlines church teaching, suggests activities for teaching Catholics about immigration, and publishes statements by the bishops. One of the most striking Catholic social teaching documents on immigration is called Strangers No Longer, Together on the Journey of Hope, which was published in 2003 by the American and Mexican bishops. In the document, they enumerate 5 different principles that emerge from the Church's teaching on migration. First, persons have the right to find opportunities in their homeland. Second, persons have the right to migrate to support themselves and their families. Third, sovereign nations have the right to control their borders. More powerful nations have a stronger obligation to accommodate migration flows. Fourth, refugees and asylum seekers should be afforded protection. And fifth, the human dignity and human rights of undocumented migrants should be respected. The month after this group started meeting, Pope Francis was elected to the papacy. What an encouragement he has been to their efforts. Hardly a week passes that Pope Francis didn't talk about the importance of protecting and welcoming migrants. The son of immigrants himself, it is clearly an issue close to his heart. His first trip outside of Rome as Pope was to Lampedusa, a port city where thousands of immigrants arrive month after month, often fleeing violence and persecution. In his first message for the World Day of Migrants and Refugees, Francis wrote that migrants and refugees are not pawns on the chessboard of humanity. They are children, women, and men who share a legitimate desire for knowing and having, but above all, for being more. The group felt emboldened to act by the clear teachings of our church on respect for migrants, which is rooted in the principles of the life and dignity of the human person, solidarity, and the common good. Their faith and social analysis combine to point them in a clear direction.